wave hands, boys feel strong enough.
Well, hello there, ladies and gentlemen. Sorry I had to push this back an hour, but in all earnestness, I was absolutely exhausted. Hopefully I'm coming in just fine. I believe I am. Let me just check this really quick. Yep, I'm sounding fine. Cool. So, it has been absolutely crazy here, ladies and gentlemen. So what happened was my apartment, in all of its glory, decided, you know, I'm going to get flooded. And I didn't get it as bad as some of the other people, but I had to be displaced for a while. Had to do that. My car died. Everything that could have gone wrong at once decided, you know, I'm going to go wrong. And that's why I haven't been posting anything. That's why it's been absolutely crazy. And I've been kind of playing catch up since then. And I've been really wanting to do more history videos because it's really become my bread and butter here on YouTube. And quite frankly, I love history. I mean, it's one of the reasons why I got a master's in it after all. And it's all, I mean, that's all kind of a part of it. And so I was kind of surfing through Facebook one day, right? And I'm a part of several, Civil War groups on Facebook. And suddenly I came across a picture. In fact, I can tell you exactly what picture it was. It was a picture that I used in the thumbnail. Let's see if I can't pull this up. Oh, come on, I know I have you in my presentation. Yeah, this one right here. Kind of getting ahead of myself here, but it was this one here. And I was like, okay, what the hell is this? And so I asked about it, inquired about it, and the guy told me, yeah, it was the Fenian invasion of Canada in 1866, and I lost it. I was like, what the fuck are you talking about? What is this? Why have I not heard of this? And it turns out that it was my new rabbit hole. Everyone should know that whenever I discover something new, I tend to go down a very deep, dark rabbit hole until I become essentially an expert on the subject as much as I possibly can. And this was absolutely no exception. This has been obsessing me over the last month and a half, trying to gather all the information that I can on it with the full intentions of making kind of like a multi-part documentary series on the very subject we're talking about today. And I said, you know what, screw it. Why don't I have nothing to talk about on my live stream, for my live show. I have no guests coming on or anything. Let's talk about this. Let's talk about this insanity, because the story is absolutely crazy. I can't believe it happened. And it's one of those things too where it's like the more I read into it, the more I'm like, hey, a lot of this happened right in my backyard. Growing up in New Hampshire, there's a huge chunk of this that happened in Vermont, and then there was another chunk of it that happened in Maine. And I'm like, this happened all around me. And yeah, I have never heard of this. This wasn't taught in any of my history classes whatsoever. I don't even remember this being mentioned in any of my history books, that there was quite literally an Irish invasion of Canada through the United States. And that's what baffled me about this whole subject. That's what got me interested in this whole thing. That there were these battles that were taking place just around, up off of the borders. That I'm like, what the fuck? How did I know? How did I not know about any of this? And the fact that it went on for such a long time as well. It went on for this specific one here just focuses on the big one, which happened in 1866. But there was also, they lasted all the way up through the 1870s. What these Fenians were doing. But you may be asking, what are the Fenians? Who are they? Well, I intend to get into that today to sort of discuss who they are, who were the major players in this whole thing. I don't know how long this is going to be because I've never really done one of these in this specific kind of format before. So I say without further ado, let's get right into this. So gentlemen, today we're going to be talking about the Fenian Raids of 1866. A very niche topic, but of course, who am I to deny that I love my niche topics? But I have my notes over on the side here, so this is a very nominal PowerPoint just to give you guys something to kind of look at while I'm, instead of just staring at my fat face talking about all this. But not many people know that the Irish actually invaded Canada. This is, and again, that's one of the whole things that really excited me about the subject, is that there was something new that I had absolutely no idea existed that wound up playing a very pivotal part in the formation of two countries that I had no idea that any of this took place. And that was both the independence of Ireland from the British, and then also, and probably more importantly, because, you know, we're on the same continent, this really led to some of the formation of Canada. And I would like to, again, establish, just judging by this title, that I'm focusing on the 1866 raids. The ones that happened in the 1870s are probably a little bit more ironically well known, with the exception of the Battle of Ridgeway. And they deserve their own topic within itself, because a lot of the players are different and stuff along those lines, and some really fascinating technological advances happened in that little tiny raid, particularly in the realm of guns, which is really fascinating. That's not for this particular discussion here. So let us move on. Here's a little introduction. So what exactly happened during this whole thing? Well, essentially, the Fenian Brotherhood invaded Canada multiple times through the 1870s, as we just discussed before. So how the hell did this happen? How did this come to fruition with a title like The Irish Invasion of Canada? How was this even a thing? Well, if you really look back at it, American and Irish history is very closely tied together. That's something that I found you will discover almost immediately once you start diving into American history of itself, is how closely tied we are with our Irish ancestry. I mean, I'm part Irish. A lot of people that I know are some people even are even full Irish, you know. So a lot of that happened because of this time period, because of the 1850s and the 1860s. Yeah. Give me a second. Why is this not updating? American history, you'll know quite. Yeah, okay, here we go. I caught up. Forgive me. So, essentially, the Fenian Brotherhood was an Irish independence organization that was unbelievably militant. Unbelievably militant, or at least a faction of it, as you will discover it coming along. It was extremely militant. And their simple goal was just the liberation of Ireland from the English. That was their simple goal, and that instead of them being over in Ireland, they were over here within the United States. And what's fascinating about them is that they are not a fringe group. This wasn't just like a small little organization. There were thousands upon thousands upon thousands of Irishmen who belonged to, either through bonds or through their military, believe it or not, that were part of the Fenian Brotherhood. In the invasion of 1866 alone, there was over 3,000 men that took part in the invasion itself. That's a huge number. That's not just a small band of 20 guys going around raiding, you know, border towns and causing trouble. 3,000 men is a significant chunk of men. That is its own army over here in the for the United States. And the other thing that's fascinating about them is that in terms of the invasion itself, all of them were American Civil War veterans. All of them. It wasn't like they were like, you know, me reenacting or reenactors or anything like that. No, they were all battle-hardened soldiers who were, you know, partaking in this whole thing. And that alone, I think, adds a level of interest an interesting side to this whole thing. It was a band of not just Northern Irish, but also Southern Irish. You had a lot of Confederate Irishmen who, after the war, came north to help partake in this war in the hopes of freeing Ireland. They were well organized, they were decently equipped, as we will discuss, and they were actually dangerous. This wasn't some small band of 20 men burning down the overall town. So what was their ultimate goal? The hell were these guys trying to achieve? Why invade Canada in the first place? Well, essentially, it was to hold a province in Canada, which was then known as British North America, and hold it hostage in exchange for the freedom of Ireland, the liberation of Ireland from the British. Does that sound nuts? That sounds kind of nuts to me. That's what started flooring me, and I quickly started realizing this is going to be an immensely fun rabbit hole, and this is going to be a farce, is the fact that they genuinely thought that was a legitimate solution to their problem, because it sounds nuts, because it is nuts. So let's really start diving into this. So let's start at part one. Part one is just the background of the Fenians, the build-up to the actual 1866, or one of the... There's multiple invasions in 1866. The build-up to the whole thing, the precursors to the whole thing, and who some of these players are that you're going to see pop up throughout the whole thing. So in terms of the background, I'm not going to lie to you. Freaking Irish independence is a mess. It is a mess that I can't even think that I can begin to even scratch the surface on. And it's just, there's so many different moving parts. There's so many different organizations, all of them kind of fighting each other in the process, all accumulating until their actual independence. I have a very hard time keeping track of it, and I don't even want to attempt to keep track of it until I really know a little bit more about the whole thing. But here's what we can say, and that is that the fight for Irish independence, it lasted longer than our country had existed by that point. Some say it's even been up to 700 years with the Normans. That they've been sort of fighting for their independence, and the Fenians found their roots during the 1848 revolutions. It's either the Young, I believe it's the Young. Let me look this up really quick. Is it the Young Rebellion or the Younger? I forget it was. Yeah, the Young Ireland Rebellion. So it's not the Younger; it's the Young Ireland Rebellion, and that was. It's kind of fun talking about, if you're talking about stuff that happened in like early to mid 1800s Europe, it's fun to play a game of how long can you talk about that subject before you get to 1848, because that was the year when all these sort of revolutions started to go around Europe. Started in France, traveled all across Europe. Most of them failed. It's one of the reasons why the monarchs were able to keep as much power as they did. It also led to the rise of Napoleon III, led to the creation of Germany as a nation itself and not a confederation of nations. Bismarck, big deal out of this whole thing. All because of the 1848 revolutions, led directly into some of the decisions that were made even all the way in World War I. And those revolutions happened in Ireland as well, with the Young Ireland Rebellions. And it was also kind of coupled with, in 1847, just a year prior, the potato famine really kicked off, which that led to a huge exodus of Irishmen to the United States, because the United States was kind of that beacon where they could practice. They had a chance to succeed over here, while the British were pretty keen on keep putting them down. At least in the United States, they kind of had a hope of doing that. So they became that big immigration. They became huge over here. Thousands upon thousands upon thousands of Irish coming over here within the 1840s, 50s, and 60s. So the 1848 revolutions really play a big part in all this. Yeah. So yeah. So the young Irish rebellion that ended in complete disaster for these guys. Complete disaster. That was crushed by the English. Most of the leadership was captured and then threatened to be put to death, but if it wasn't for the fact that a bunch of, like, thousands upon thousands of people signed a petition to spare them, they all would have been put to death. And then most of the Irish immigrants, when they were coming over to the United States, they went to the north. They went to the north because of the factories. That's where the money was. It was the industrious north. They had the best chance of finding a job and earning a living. So in terms of the leadership of what was to become the Fenian Brotherhood, we essentially have two people. We have two notable people. Both were veterans of the failed rebellion. One of these vets was actually Thomas Francis Mager of the Irish Brigade. The Irish Brigade, the one that took place at Fredericksburg. That Irish Brigade. Yeah, he found his roots, and he came over here because of the failed revolution in 1848. But the two most notable people that we could talk about are Thomas Stevens, who is this guy right here, and then you have John O'Mahony, who is this stunning individual right here. They both escaped to Europe at first. They didn't come to the United States immediately. O'Mahony would eventually go to the United States. But they went to Europe, shopped around. They taught and translated books and stuff like that to sort of support themselves. But they never lost sight of the goal, and their ultimate goal was to free Ireland from British rule. They never lost sight of that, and even from the beginning of their exile, they're beginning to plot the next phase of their plan. So we have John O'Mahony. He heads to America in 1856, and he helped form the actual Fenian Brotherhood with a guy named Michael Doheny, and their simple goal was the fight to overthrow British rule in Ireland. That was kind of their slogan. Both of them were rather radical people, veterans of the 1848 revolution, and failed revolution. And so they wanted to continue the fight instead of over in Ireland where they needed to be secretive. Said they wanted to be over here in the United States where they could practice it in the open. And over here, here's the pledge that they have, and I'm going to read it. I solemnly pledge my sacred word and honor as a truthful and honest man, that I will labor with earnest zeal for the liberation of Ireland from the yoke of England, and for the establishment of a free and independent government of Irish soil, that I will implicitly obey the commands of my superior officers in the Fenian Brotherhood, that I will faithfully discharge the duties of my membership as laid down in the Constitution and bylaws thereof, and I will do my utmost to promote feelings of love, harmony, and kindly forbearance among the Irishmen, and that I will foster and defend and propagate the aforesaid Fenian Brotherhood to the utmost of my power. Now, something you'll notice almost immediately is they mention the Constitution and the bylaws in there. That was very big within the Fenian Brotherhood. They had a very strong republic ideology. We'll get more into how their government worked, but it's almost kind of like they were like a small government, a small nation within the United States, sort of acting autonomously from everyone else. And we'll get into a little bit more of the details of how that was sort of structured and everything like that, because that plays a pivotal part into why the invasions happened in the first place. So Thomas Stevens, he remains in Ireland while O'Mahony goes to the United States, and Stevens forms basically the sort of companion organization in Ireland called the Irish Republican Brotherhood. And the Fenians and the Brotherhood, they remained in constant contact with each other throughout the entire thing, in close communiques, because they wanted to, as best as they could, at least from the get-go, coordinate their efforts towards that ultimate goal of freeing Ireland from British tyranny. So then a little hiccup comes along in these guys' story. Just a little thing called the American Civil War. And, well, it turned out to be kind of a happy accident. I mean, there was some good. I mean, there was some bad with it. Don't get me wrong, but there was definitely a lot of good to be gained from the American Civil War that the Fenians quickly discovered. Now, to get the bad out of the way, it did hinder their ability to achieve their goal. You know, suddenly they had to fight this war because guess what? They were now American citizens, and they were being drafted left and right, especially come 1863 forward. And the Irish did make up a huge chunk of the Union Army, all these Irish immigrants. So that sort of got in the way. But the good that came out of this was they quickly realized that it meant military training for officers and rank and file. The members of the Fenian Brotherhood could use this war as a means to train themselves for true military combat and true military action, which is what they wanted. Remember, they wanted to free Ireland, and the way how O'Mahony and Stevens saw that was it was going to have to be done through armed rebellion. Well, what better way to get training than through an actual war? In fact, O'Mahony, he became a colonel in the 69th Regiment of New York State Militia, and they were one of the big ones. You know, they were known reportedly as the Fighting 69th. General Robert E. Lee apparently called them that. They were a tough bunch of sons of bitches. And they were an all-Irish regiment because everyone was segregated back then. And so you had a lot of Irish brigades, Irish regiments, and a lot of the ideas that, you know, like the Fenian Brotherhood liked to promote would accumulate in these camps and stuff like that and go around, and people would join, people would get interested, and the Fenian Brotherhood exploded because of the war, because of everything that happened within the war, the close proximity all of these Irishmen had with each other. Stuff like this could accumulate, and we eventually get what we do within 1866. So before the American Civil War, many of these people were, you know, lawyers, scholars, intellectuals, with a lot of the lower classes, the laborers of Irish society. There was no kind of in-between. Those are what you had. And now suddenly you have this war, and suddenly most of these people were now unified by being battle-hardened veterans. They were all suddenly, they all fought in this war together. They were now all soldiers. That sort of unified them. So you have a unified mentality that now we're all equal in terms of being veterans of this war, and they're all unified in a cause to liberate Ireland. So in terms of that, we get the organization, which is where some of the fun comes in my humble opinion. The Fenian Constitution of 1863. So yeah, they were having all these meetings and having all these votes, even with Confederate Irishmen during this time period, because the Fenians blatantly thought that they were Irish first, and either American or Confederate second. But the Fenian Constitution of 1863, it was they basically modeled themselves after a republic, very similar to the ideals that they wanted in Ireland. They didn't want Ireland to be a monarchy or anything like that. They wanted it to be a republic, an Irish republic. And reconstitute on the model of the institutions of a republic, governing itself on the elective body, kind of like a nation within a nation. That's what it kind of feels like, and it is in line with the ideologies they held over in Ireland and shared Republican outlooks, you know. And they just worked like that. They became like this self-sustaining system, and we'll get into a little bit more of that in a little bit. But they had a president, and then they had a Senate. The president had a council of 10 with him, and the president was elected, and it was O'Mahony. He became the president in 1865, and he was elected in Philadelphia, Missouri. And then you had a Senate, which also had their own president, which was a guy by the name of William R. Roberts. Now, O'Mahony, this is where the fractionalism starts. You'll start seeing a divide in the Fenian Brotherhood with this. You have the John O'Mahony camp, and then you have the William R. Roberts camp. which would become known as the president faction and the Senate faction, as to what course of action the Fenian Brotherhood would take in the goings about of freeing Ireland from British tyranny. And William R. Roberts was the most vocal opponent to John O'Mahony. But I don't think, for reasons you might think off the top of your head, considering that O'Mahony was a colonel in the American Civil War. And you will also argue that the Senate also had the most control over the Fenian Brotherhood as a whole, as you will discover as we go along. But there's something that they were very good at, and the Fenians were unbelievably good at raising money. Very good at raising money. They had tons of it. Not just, to keep their organization going, but to also continuously train and have this mini army at their disposal. And they would do this through bonds to pay for the organization, and specifically the soldiers. And they had a song, too. They even had their own little song called A Nation Once Again. They sort of used that as an anthem, to kind of unite themselves. Now, the government knew that the Fenians were out there. They had a militia, quote-unquote militia, that they were out there doing things and being weird. They knew that there's something out there, but they didn't really seem to care, especially come 1865 and 1866. In fact, many people in the House and Senate of the United States, they weren't necessarily in favor of what the Fenians were doing, but they certainly willingly turned a blind eye to them. And a lot of that was because Britain and Canada's sort of nominal support for the Confederacy. And guess what? The Confederacy lost a war, and it being 1865 and 1866, yeah, that's still a pretty deep, fresh wound in the minds of the American people. So the fact that the Fenians were being pretty anti-British, anti-Canadian, well, that's just A-okay in our books for right now. So, yeah, we'll just let them sort of do their thing for now. Now, one of the key things that happened because of it being the end of the American Civil War was a crap ton of surplus weapons. And I mean thousands upon thousands upon thousands of weapons that were produced and now suddenly didn't have a home. And this was before, the surplus weapons thing that we have today kind of existed. In fact, I believe the Secretary of War at this time actually banned the idea of selling these weapons to private buyers for quite a while. And that had a very negative effect on the market. I'll tell you that. Something was extremely oversaturated. And the example that we have here is a guy by the name of Alfred Jenks. And he worked for the Bridesburg Manufacturing Company. Now, the Bridesburg Manufacturing Company, well, essentially what they did is they made the Bridesburg Springfield, which in itself sounds kind of silly, but the most prominent musket that the American Army used, the U.S. Army used in the American Civil War was the 1863 Springfield, of course produced in Springfield, and a very decent musket. Well, Bridesburg said, we're going to copy that and sell it on the market. In fact, they were doing that for quite a while and being very successful at it. The American government was buying it up to, rapidly give their soldiers because they needed any and all weapons they could. But suddenly that war ended, and Alfred Jenks found that suddenly he had 7,500 of these Bridesburg rifled muskets sitting on his lap that nobody wanted to buy, that he couldn't really do anything with, and he was probably going to go belly up because of it. In fact, a lot of these companies that were manufacturing weapons and doing extremely well during the American Civil War were going belly up left and right because suddenly they're producing all these weapons, suddenly the war's over, and suddenly they have all of these weapons just sitting there left over that they poured all these resources and time and money into, and nobody wants to buy them anymore. And that's what the most famous example of that is actually Spencer, the Spencer rifle and the Spencer carbine. Those are huge during the American Civil War, and we'll see them pop up again later on within this presentation. But that company indeed went belly up because they just couldn't handle the sudden crash in the economy when it came to the guns. And the Bridesburg Manufacturing Company was about to go belly up if it wasn't for the fact that a bunch of rich Fenians came along and say, yeah, I noticed that you have 7,500 of these Bridesburg rifled muskets. Could we possibly take those off of your hands? And Alfred Jenks was like, oh yeah, you can. And he gave them, for very low costs, a crap ton of rifled muskets. And so now suddenly this Fenian army, who were now free because the Civil War was over, now had muskets again. You know? Now suddenly they had the weapons to sort of back up their muscle. So off they go. And it got to the point where, again, and I mentioned this earlier, they had their own uniforms. Right? They were so far along that they actually had their own uniform, but that came a little bit later. Come 1866, you know, you had a lot. Most of the Fenians were based up in the north, for obvious reasons that I explained earlier. But you even had Irish Confederates, who then at the end of the war traveled and traversed their way north to help out with the Fenian Brotherhood. And so when you saw the uniforms, you saw that a lot of them were a mixture of Union and Confederate uniforms. You had a lot of grays, you had a lot of blues, you had a lot of butternut. And so it was a whole smorgasbord of that, but they were unified by the color green and gold. They usually had a green banner with gold trimming and stuff like that, and eventually they did have their own uniform. They had enough money to produce their own uniform for their militia, for their army, which was basically a green U.S. Shell coat with gold trim. However, that was more towards after 1866 and more toward the 1870s one. Most of these people removed their U.S. emblems or CSA emblems and just called that good enough for their uniforms. But they looked like a professional army. So the best known painting, I kind of showed you this earlier, is this one here, the Battle of Ridgeway. And so this is completely inaccurate because despite the fact that you see that the uniforms here are indeed green, which is accurate with the gold trimming, they didn't have those uniforms yet. So in reality, this is more like what they probably would have looked like. A whole kind of a smorgasbord of blue, gray, and some green. That's really more of what they would have looked like in terms of what their uniforms were. But a pretty decent kind of, it looks like an early Civil War uniform is what that looks like. Early Civil War era. So what was their plan? What the hell were they going to do? They knew they were going to do something. They had an army sitting here, and they've been training this army and drilling this army. So what the hell are they going to do? Well, their first plan was to actually not invade Canada, but to invade Ireland, because Ireland was the country that they needed to liberate. Makes sense, right? Well, they quickly realized that, well, that's easier said than done, and the biggest reason why is they didn't raise a navy, they raised an army. So how the hell are they going to get their boys over to Ireland and also get through the might of the British Navy? Yeah, we didn't think about that, did we? So we're going to get back to that because this highlights the factionalism that happened within the Fenians themselves. You know, the William R. Roberts, he wanted to instead, and he was the one who came up with this idea, let's invade Canada. Insert South Park reference here. So he came up with the idea of let's hold a province hostage in exchange for Irish independence. Well, despite the fact that that idea sounds utterly insane, a lot of them jumped on this idea and thought that they could actually do it. And that's the thing that baffles me, is the total blind idealism that you're going to see throughout this entire story, is that they genuinely thought that this would work. This faction was insane. They actually thought that invading Canada, holding that they were actually not just going to be able to hold a province hostage, but then have that to win Irish independence. They actually thought that that was going to work. That boggles my mind to this day. But on top of that, Roberts actually found a guy who backed him, General T.W. Sweeney. He backed his decisions and actually agreed that, yes, we should invade Canada, and yes, we should hold a province, and yes, that will somehow free Ireland. This guy here in this picture, that is William R. Roberts right there, his distinguished mustache. But that was the Senate faction, really. The President faction, on the other hand, you'd think they would be the more militant ones out of the bunch, but in reality, they're not. O'Mahony is actually got a relatively decent head on his shoulders. He is the president at this time of the Fenian Brotherhood, and he wanted to just send funds and smuggle weapons into Ireland because he knew that's what they were good at. There were all these surplus. We just discussed this. There were all these surplus weapons over here in the United States. Yep, let's buy them up and smuggle them over because we're also very good at raising money over here, and there is a lot more money over here in North America than there is over in Ireland. And over here, we can operate openly and freely and express our views in the newspapers, which would bite them in the ass later. While in Ireland, everything has to be done underground. So this should be the way we do it to help our sister organization, the Irish Republican Brotherhood, and let them do the fighting because they're the ones that are actually over there. And the other thing that I find kind of fascinating is that what is this? O'Mahony was the only one that actually had the idea in his head, you know, maybe we should talk to some of the Canadian Irishmen, because they do exist, and see if they were sympathetic towards the Fenian cause or not. And it turned out that a lot of them were sympathetic towards the Fenian cause of liberating Ireland. That they were over here for very much the same reason that a lot of them came over to North America, because of the plague or because they were veterans of the failed 1848 revolutions. But it also became clear that they would not like it if suddenly their homes were invaded by a standing army, essentially. And so O'Mahony said, "Nah, I'm not in favor of this idea of invading Canada at all. In fact, that's kind of a silly plan if you really look at it." See, on to Canada. The Fenian cry. We are the Fenian Brotherhood, skilled in the arts of war, and we're going to fight for Ireland and the land that we adore. Many battles we have won, along with the boys in blue, and we'll go and capture Canada, for we've nothing else to do. Well, I think that sums it up perfectly right there, doesn't it? We have nothing else to do. So let's talk about this. The earliest raid in 1866 was a really disorganized mess. That happened in February of 1866 by a guy named John R. Ballard, who was kind of acting, from what I read, sort of independently. There actually isn't much information on this, but we know we made it as far as St. Albans, Vermont, and this rebellion just kind of fizzled out because American authorities kind of got involved, and it kind of scared a lot of the militia about, and they just sort of fizzled out, and nothing really came of this invasion. But here's what did come from this invasion, right? The newspapers. The newspapers became a huge problem for the Fenians, and they kind of brought it upon themselves. So the Fenians, they were quite vocal, and the newspapers would pick up on all that. They would even give interviews for the newspapers. And the Fenians had the idea that if they did this, it would bolster their numbers. It would get people to want to join them. And in some ways that worked, but it also tipped their hands rather frequently. They weren't very secretive about what they wanted to do. They weren't at all. Especially after that first one in February, the Canadians got wind of what was going on, and it's hard to ignore thousands of men in uniform on the march. It's kind of hard to ignore that. And the Canadians, of course, learned about these raids through the newspapers, through word of mouth, through people mentioning that, hey, they kind of want to invade Canada, and that put them on high alert. They put them on such high alert that the British Parliament actually had to act upon the whole thing. And the British Parliament actually agreed to suspend the rights of habeas corpus within Canada. And that traveled fast through Canada, as it was the whole idea that, hey, these guys were actually very close. They got all the way into Vermont. They were very close to actually invading our borders. That certainly raised a bunch of alarms for the Canadians, particularly in the militia, to the point that Lord Charles Monk's was it Lonk or Monk? Yeah, give me a second. I can't remember if it was Monk or... Yeah, it was Monk. Okay. So Lord Charles Monk, I didn't know if it was that or Locke. He dispatched his Secretary of the Colonies, and here's what his dispatch read, quote, information had reached me from many quarters tending to shew an intention on the part of the Fenians to make an inroad on Canadian territory. These reports had induced a feeling of great uneasiness and insecurity amongst the people. So the Canadian militia were then put on high alert because of this. And they were really fearing St. Patrick's Day. They were like, oh God, what are these crazy Irishmen going to do at our border? The last time we had something like this happen on our border was the War of 1812. So maybe we should kind of get ready and look out for these sons of bitches while we possibly can. Well, the factionalism continued in the O'Mahony camp in New York and the Roberts Senate camp. They kept fighting each other. O'Mahony... he began shifting his focus on raising funds for the Irish rebels. James Stephens, again, all that stuff. But then William R. Roberts turned out to be the more militant faction, and he just wanted to try the invasion again, but this time just do it a little bit more organized. And this created a massive divide in the Fenian Brotherhood. And it was explained in the New York Times, rather vocally within the New York Times. Someone said an attack must be made in Ireland on this side would ruin the cause. And that very much sort of explains the mentality of the president camp, the president faction, but the Senate faction outruled them. They just had more members, and O'Mahony had to kind of concede to the idea that, yeah, we're going to invade Canada. But there were two conventions that happened in 1866 that really solidified the idea that, yes, we're going to go up north and we're going to invade Canada from across the United States border and somehow hold a province hostage. There was one in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and then there was one in New York, New York. One led by Mahoney and the other by Roberts. There were no Canadian representatives at Roberts' convention, and it was at Roberts' convention that they decided that we are going to go full throttle, balls deep, into this invasion of Canada. And you'd think they would at least try to think that maybe we should ask the Irish Canadians what they think should be done, you know, like O'Mahony did. And you'd think you'd want to know their opinion. Now, he knew the Canadian Fenian sympathizers, O'Mahony, they would not support an invasion. They just would not. And Roberts just didn't listen to it, or he just didn't believe it. He honestly thought that they would probably just come along and be just fine, that everything was going to be okay. But O'Mahony knew the reality, and Roberts just blatantly ignored him. O'Mahony kept his position as president very nominally, but he had to listen to the larger numbers in the militant Senate faction. He had to bow. They were going to invade Canada, whether he liked it or not. And, well, if they're going to invade Canada, well, then at least he can do is lead this makeshift army and do it himself. And that's exactly what O'Mahony does. So this leads to the New Brunswick invasion of April 17th, 1866. This is a very laughable affair, but the Fenian army was indeed led by John O'Mahony against his better judgment, and he led around 700 Fenians into this invasion, and they all arrived in Maine, in southern Maine, and they hope to seize Campobello Island near New Brunswick. It's still there, and there's a map I'm going to pull up in just a second to kind of show you where this is geographically. And their idea was to seize that island and use that as ransom. However, the raid was stopped almost immediately. Almost immediately. And it was quickly stopped by the actions of the Royal Navy, specifically a guy named Charles Hastings Doyle. So here's a map of where it is. This is where it all went. You got Eastport here. This is Maine. Here's Canada. There's New Brunswick. And they wanted to seize... let's see. Go back. Yeah, there we go. They wanted to seize this island here. Hold that for ransom in exchange for Ireland. And they thought this was a good idea. But that's the island that they wanted. And they were stopped by this gentleman, this distinguished gentleman here. That is Charles Hastings Doyle. And he acted quickly, and he sent several warships to intercept the Fenians. And O'Mahony, instead of choosing to fight with the British ships, he knew that they themselves didn't have that much of a navy, therefore they didn't have much of a hope. He decided right there and then to stand down, really before the true invasion could even begin. So in many ways, this is just a more glorified repeat of what happened back in February. And the 700 Fenians were dispersed. Some were arrested, but most just sort of walked away and sort of fizzled out and waited for their next bit of orders. Now, what came out of all this is it had a huge impact on Canada, because now this was the second time the Fenians had tried to invade their land, and so this increased the call for Canadian unification. In some ways, it kind of reminds me of what was going on in Germany within the 1840s and 50s, where they felt like they were being threatened, and there's a whole... it's more political over there than this, but the idea that this sort of confederation or the sort of hodgepodge of different nations within or British colonies would need to unite in the sole purpose of defending themselves in the light of something like a Fenian invasion. And that was the biggest impact of all this. You have Nova Scotia, Upper Canada, Quebec, and they begin to form, in 1867, the Dominion of Canada. And that all happens because of the Fenian actions that happened, because the fact that they were just about to be invaded twice genuinely terrified people along the border. Genuinely terrified those people. So the aftermath of this is O'Mahony was out. He was out because he did not support another invasion into Canada. But Roberts brought back General T.W. Sweeney, this guy in this slide here, who was another Civil War vet, a distinguished one, and a general. And Sweeney this time would lead an invasion into Canada, because Sweeney apparently actually believed that invading Canada was the right action, while O'Mahony did a haphazard job of it because he knew it would fail. Or at least that was the mentality that Roberts certainly had. And this is getting kind of silly. This is all rather silly. Sweeney came up with this whole idea, right? He will now lead the Fenian army in O'Mahony's stead, and if at first you don't succeed, just try again. Now, the whole idea that he had was for this new invasion was he wanted a two-pronged attack to disperse and confuse the Canadian militia and British regulars. We wanted an entire to try to figure any of this out. A two-pronged attack. Because he really feared the British regulars. He didn't really fear the militia too much, because they were just that. They were a militia. And if there's anything that both the Mexican-American War and then certainly the American Civil War proved, is that the militia is only good for certain things. It's the regulars who are the battle-hardened troops that you really need to kind of watch out for. And the reason why is because, well, they would be in their home turf. They would be experienced soldiers. Doesn't matter how experienced the Fenians were, they would only have X amount of supplies and men to work with. And the, Canadians would, on purpose, have an infinite amount of resources to go up against them. But their ultimate goals were very simple. Along Canada West, let's see, Canada West, which was now southern Ontario, and there'd be one Canada East, which is southern Quebec. And their idea would be to cut Canada West from Canada East so no British reinforcements could come. So one would get all the attention, while the other one would allow the Fenians to roam kind of freely because of this. So as a result, one of these was more of a diversionary attack. What just happened to my notes? What the fuck has happened to my notes? One moment. Invasion is about to begin. Yeah, there we go. It was a diversionary attack on Fort Erie, and they would launch it from Buffalo, New York. And this was supposed to be the diversionary attack, and this would draw Canadian troops from Toronto. And this would start in June of 1866. That was the date that it was decided on. They would start in the month of June. And Sweeney supposedly would kind of lead this attack, even though it mainly went to a guy named O'Neill. And then Canada East, so no British reinforcements. Yeah, there we go. The diversionary attack in Buffalo. There we go. And the numbers that they had would be anywhere between 1,000 and 1,500 men. Now, you're going to see something a little interesting here, and I don't think it was planned this way. I think it just, as we will discover, kind of panned out this way. So this is the idea of them going into the Niagara River area. The main attack would actually be in Canada East, aka Quebec. And this would be led by a guy named General Samuel Spear. And he would have about 1,000 men. So you notice this would go through Vermont, and he had about 1,000 men. So if you notice that the diversionary plan actually has more men than the actual plan itself. And I don't think it was planned that way. I believe, and we'll go into this a little bit more, the original idea was that the actual plan itself, this one here would have more men than what ended up happening. But more people ended up going. It's sort of the inverse happened. Is what I'm trying to say. But here is the idealized mission. Here's what it supposedly would have looked like if everything were to have worked. You had West Wing, you had Fenians coming in from Chicago, go up through the Great Lakes, and go up into Ontario, meet up here. The vast majority of them, as it would turn out, would go in through Buffalo, go in through Fort Erie, and they go up this way. And then you had the main attack actually happening here, going towards Quebec City. That was their initial plan. This is what they wanted to do. This is what they wanted to achieve. How far this would go, we're about to find out. Well, in late May of 1866, the invasion was indeed about to begin. It was on, gentlemen. The war was going to happen, and General Sweeney placed a public letter in New York and Buffalo, and I have it all here for you in full. We come among you as foes of British rule in Ireland. We have taken up the sword to strike down as the oppressor's rod, to deliver Ireland from the tyrant, the despoiler, the robber. We have registered our oaths upon the altar of our country in the full view of heaven, and sent out our vows to the throne of him who inspired them. Then, looking about us for an enemy, we find him here in your midst, and where he is most vulnerable and convenient
to our strength. We have no issue with the people of these provinces, and wish to have none but the most friendly relations. Our weapons are of the oppressors of Ireland. Our bows shall be directed only against the power of England. Her privileges alone shall we invade, not yours. We do not propose to divest you of a solitary right you now enjoy. We are here neither as murderers nor robbers, for plunder or exploitation. We are here as the Irish Army of Liberation, the friends of liberty against despotism, of democracy against aristocracy, of people against their oppressors. In a world, our war is with the armed powers of England, not with the people, not with these provinces, against England upon land and sea, till Ireland is free. To Irishmen throughout these provinces, we appeal in the name of 7 centuries of British inequity and Irish misery and suffering. In the names of our murdered sires, our desolate homes, our desecrated altars, our millions of famine graves, our insulted name and race, to stretch forth the hand of brotherhood in the holy cause of the fatherland, and smite the tyrant where we can. We conjure you, our countrymen, whom from misfortune inflicted by the very tyranny you are serving, or from any other cause, have been forced to enter the ranks of the enemy, not to be willing instruments of your country's death and degradation. No uniform, and surely not the blood-dyed coat of England, can emancipate you from the natural law that binds your allegiance to Ireland, to liberty, to right, to justice, to the friends of Ireland, of freedom, of humanity, of the people. We offer the olive branch of those and the honest grasp of friendship. Take it, Irishman, Frenchman, American, take it all and trust it. We wish to meet with friends. We are prepared to meet with enemies. We shall endeavor to merit the confidence of the former, and the latter can expect from us but the leniency of a determined though generous foe, and the restraints and relations imposed by civilized warfare. Well, doesn't that just sound all dandy? But you can see there, and why I posted the full thing, this genuine need or want from the Fenians, particularly Sweeney, to try to get Canadian Irishmen in particular to help them out, to give them supplies, to join their side, and to join their cause. But remember, O'Mahony knows that that's not going to happen. That isn't what they want. They want Irish independence, yes, but they also don't want an army invading their home. And that's exactly what the Fenians are about to do. President Roberts also posted something rather publicly, a call to arms that reads, quote, "To my countrymen, brothers, arouse, Irishmen, a glorious career has been opened for you. The green flag has waved once more in triumph over England's hated emblem. Onward is the order, and let Ireland and..." I can't really pronounce that. Be the watchword. I take. Pay no attention to what may seem defeat. Notice how he says that. Pay no attention. The odds are stacked against us, but pay no attention to it is essentially what he's saying. Everything is working gloriously. And if you discharge your duty to your native land, our final triumph is certain. God and justice is on our side. Have iron wills and brave hearts, and Ireland will once more be great, glorious, and free. Now, the interesting thing about all this is, those sound like pretty words and everything, right? Those sound wonderful. However, they're also very public, and they were published before the invasion began. So guess what? the Canadians got authority of the. They got wind of this. They got wind that, hey, guess what? Another invasion's going to happen. So having read all of this within the newspapers, the Ottawa Governor General, he wrote this. At former times, the Commander-in-Chief has had occasion to call for the active service of the volunteer force to maintain international obligations and as a precaution against threatened attack. Those threats have now ripened into actual fact. The soil of Canada has been invaded, not in the practice of legitimate warfare, but by a lawless band, in defiance of moral right, and in utter disregard of all the obligations which civilization imposes on mankind. Now we get into the meat and cream of this whole thing. Gentlemen, I need to take a sip of water because I've just been talking now for a full hour. I need to take a sip of water. We will be right back for part 2, the actual invasion.
Color of the martyr dead, our own immortal green. Then up for the green, boys, and up for the green. Oh, 'tis down in the dust and a shame to be seen. But we've hands, oh, we've hands, boys, full strong enough, I ween, to rescue and to raise again our own immortal green.
They may say they have power, 'tis vain to oppose. 'Tis better to obey and live than surely die as foes. We can scorn all their threats, boys, whatever they may mean, for we trust in God above us and we dearly love the green. So we'll up for the green, boys, and up for the green. Oh, to die is far better than be cursed as we've been.
And we've hearts, oh, we've hearts, boys, full true enough, I ween, to rescue and to raise again our own immortal green. They may swear, as they often did, our wretchedness to cure, but we'll never trust John Bull again and let his lies allure. No, we won't, Bull, for now or evermore, for we've hopes on the ocean and we've trust on the shore. Then up for the green, boys, and up for the green. Shout it back to the Sassenach, we'll never sell the green. For our tone is coming back, and with men enough, I ween, to rescue and avenge us and our own immortal green.
Oh, remember the days the rain we disturbed at Limerick and Too's Blackwater and Benburb, and asked this proud Saxon if our blows he'd enjoy when we met him at the battlefield of France at Fontenoy.
Then we'll up for the green, boys, and up for the green. Oh, 'tis still in the dust and a shame to be seen. But we've hearts and we've hands, boys, full strong enough, I ween, to rescue and to raise again our own unsullied green. Then we'll up for the green, boys, and up for the green. Oh, 'tis still in the dust and a shame to be seen. But we've hearts and we've hands, boys, full strong enough, I ween, to rescue and to raise again our own unsullied green. In the morning by my side sat the darling of my pride, and our happy children round us were at play. When the news spread through the land that the Fenians were at hand, at our country's call we'll cheerfully obey.
Hello. Sorry about that. Forgive me. I just really needed a drink. And quite frankly, I also needed to put a fan on me. And I think, quite frankly, my fan now is going way too... Yeah, way too much. Give me a second. Let me go to my filters. So something that I would like to also apologize for is... yeah, I gotta turn down that fan. Be back again.
For beneath the Union Jack we will drive the Fenians back, and we'll fight for our beloved Canadian home. the green, oh, the green is the color of the true, and we'll back it against the orange, and we'll raise it o'er the blue. For the color of old Ireland alone should here be seen, 'tis the color of the martyr dead, our own immortal green. Then up for...
All right. I am back now. I kind of threw this PowerPoint presentation together literally last night because I wasn't going to do that. It was just going to be a lecture, but then I decided, hey, you guys need something visual, so I apologize for all the typos. Not very professional me, and I kind of am embarrassed by it, but I figured it was better than nothing. So let's just getting into the meat and cream of this now. We're going to talk about part 2. Part 2 is what everybody has actually been caring about, which is the actual invasion of Canada itself. The Irish invasion of Canada. So we're going to start with Canada West, because Canada West is where a lot of the action actually took place. This is where the majority of everything happened. It started on June 1st of 1866, 158 years ago. And the Fenians move and seize Fort Erie. It started off early in the morning. On June 1st, and the Fenians started to accumulate in Buffalo. Just as planned, and the objective was to seize Fort Erie. And I couldn't believe it, but they actually had around 8,000 rifles just sort of cached in Buffalo, because they've been planning this for a while. They knew that they were going to do something in Buffalo, New York, so they actually... They've been caching arms there for a while, and I find it interesting that the authorities just didn't seem to really care. They just really didn't seem to care that they had all these arms there. They knew something was going to happen, and yet they didn't bother to seize any of it or try to stop any of it. So here we are. So the local officials, they warned the commander of the USS Michigan, hey, there's a lot of Fenians accumulating, and they are decently well armed. Maybe you should pay attention to that. I think they're about to springboard their warned invasion into Canada. And so they tell the USS Michigan about the increasing Fenian presence, and in the nearby garrison at Fort Porter, they only have about 50 men there. Against a Fenian army that had already accumulated to 850 people, so 50 men don't stand a chance. And it is around here that 200 men they had 1,300 Fenians total that showed up. And then they had 200 of those people sort of split off from the main body and traverse north ahead of the rest of them. And so these guys seized Fort Erie. They were led by a guy named Colonel John O'Neill. He was the guy who led that 200-man detachment. And he managed to sabotage the U.S. gunboat so it wouldn't get in their way as they continued their invasion over into Canada. And this also meant that the commander of the USS Michigan, he failed to get reinforcements to stop the Fenian invasion from happening. So what happened over towards New Brunswick, where suddenly the British had all these ships get in the way, which completely stopped the Fenian invasion in their tracks, did not happen here. They were kind of prepared for that, sabotaged the nearest ship as quickly as possible so that way it couldn't get reinforcements, couldn't get the word out that this invasion was happening, and that did indeed succeed. And because of that, they crossed the Niagara River, and they quickly cut off and stuff like that. And for 14 hours, it took 14 hours for the USS Michigan to be active again. And I find that a little hard to believe that it took them 14 hours. So a part of me thinks, because that's just so convenient, a part of me thinks that what happened is the commander of the USS Michigan was either slightly sympathetic towards the Fenian cause, or probably because he was somewhat of a veteran of the American Civil War in some way, probably was still pissed off at Canada and Britain for nominally helping the Confederacy. So he kind of let them go. Just kind of turned a blind eye to it. Whoops, it took a little longer than we expected to get our ship repaired. There's no proof of this. I found no sources to state this at all in anything that I've read. But they all say the same thing, that it took it about 14 hours for them to be repaired. And that, to me, that just seems like an awfully, awfully long and convenient time to get the Fenians into Canada. But once it is fixed, reinforcements do arrive, and now the USS Michigan and a couple of other gunboats, they now cut off the Fenians and strand them in Canada. So at 1:30 a.m., 250 Fenians have officially... By 1:30 a.m., 250 Fenians have landed in Canada. And Lieutenant Colonel George Owen Starr's 17th Kentucky Fenian Regiment, to show you just the organization of these guys, they actually had regiments. And his job was to sort of go out on ahead, cut telegraph wires, and take control of the railways. And in that, they partially succeeded in causing some chaos and buying the rest of the Fenian army time to get across the Niagara River. But something that they experienced almost immediately were the dwindling numbers that were reported. O'Neill reported that he started off with around 1,300 men, but that soon dwindled as public support was minimal for their invasion. They got kind of a cold shoulder, which is not what they expected. Again, that's what O'Mahony expected, but for some reason the Senate faction just kind of ignored. And once they were cut off by the USS Michigan and those gunboats, people started kind of turning a blind eye, started getting kind of a cold shoulder, and started running away. So that number of 1,300, which was a sizable number, quickly dwindled to about 800 men, which is still a sizable force, don't get me wrong. It's just not as much as they need. They need more. And so what he does is he falls back on what he's been told by Roberts and Sweeney. Galvanize the Irish-Canadian locals to join him and give him supplies, because remember, now he's completely cut off because of the gunboats, and he basically, all he has is what he has, so he's going to have to rely on foraging, and he doesn't want to do that. It's been made clear by Sweeney and carried through by O'Neill here that they are not going to terrorize the people, they are not going to steal everyone's crop. The war is with England and not against its people. But instead of that warm embrace that Sweeney and especially Roberts thought that they would get, turns out O'Mahony was right. They are met by anger, regardless if they are Irish-Canadian or not. And they were not expecting this. They genuinely thought that they would rise, and help them in their invasion of Canada. So the Fenian organization is actually rather interesting to look at. So they were broken up into several regiments. You had the 7th Buffalo New York Regiment, the 18th Ohio, the 13th Tennessee, and the 17th Kentucky and Fenian Regiments. And all of these were battle-hardened men and were decently organized. Their biggest issue was actually that blind optimism that I don't know if any of you guys have been noticing, but I certainly have. This blind optimism that they thought that this was still going to succeed, even with just 800 men. They were still going to manage, that was still enough to hold some kind of province hostage in exchange for Irish freedom. And that sort of blinded them toward the reality of the situation, which is that would never work in a million years. It wasn't going to work in a million years. But yet they continued to go. They continued to go through with it. And in that, I agree with the historical sentiment that it was this idealism that completely blinded them. That this idealism really kind of kept them from seeing the reality of their situation. Where I disagree with the general historians is that a lot of them describe the Fenians as being sort of like this a band of hoodlums, you know, a bunch of people who were playing soldier, who weren't really soldiers. And that they were nothing but bandits. And, well, certainly they were. They were invading a country and everything like that. Don't get me wrong. They were terrorists in that realm. I can't say they were hoodlums, especially over in this invasion, because they weren't going after people specifically. They weren't going after the citizens. They weren't going after property. They weren't destroying property. They weren't foraging like they probably should have. But they were also all battle-hardened veterans of the American Civil War. So to call them hoodlums, I can't really agree with that historical sentiment. And it was just mainly their blind optimism. You know, Roberts and Sweeney, they were just completely wrong. They thought that they were going to get support. They thought they were going to get help, and they didn't. And O'Neill was ordered not to cause property damage, and O'Neill went through with that when he probably should have, just to keep himself supplied. Now, the Canadian organization had several things. The Great Western Railway was ordered immediately to be at the disposal of the Canadian military. And in the nearby vicinity had the Queen's Own Rifles of Toronto, 13th Hamilton Battalion, the York Rifle Company, and the Haldimand Rifled Militia, as well as 28 students of the University Rifle Militia as well. And interestingly, in the upcoming battle, one of the veterans of this would be Alexander Muir, who was author of the great Canadian song "The Maple Leaf Forever." He was a veteran of this coming war, and they're numbered about 850 men. So if you really look at it, the Fenians and the Canadians right now are on relatively equal footing. And this leads to the big battle of the whole thing, the Battle of Ridgeway. The thing that started off my whole rabbit hole was this battle right here. The Battle of Ridgeway, which happened early on June 2nd, 1866. So news arrives at the Fenian camp at around 2:30 a.m. of a Canadian militia and some British regulars, again, the British regulars they feared, were arriving within 5 miles of them. Now, primary sources say that the Fenians thought that they were facing about 1,500 men, when in reality, all the Canadians had were about 850. They were more on equal footing, but the Fenians didn't know that. And this riled up many of the Fenians, and they wanted to fight. They wanted to fight, and others were scared off. You know, so there were some that wanted to fight and some that didn't. So the Fenian numbers kept dwindling as a result of all this. And most of the frightened, they had no way back to get across. Because, again, they were cut off and blocked by the USS Michigan, the very boat that they sabotaged. So, yeah, here we go. They were also extremely frightened of British regulars, to establish that right now, for reasons that I stated earlier. The British regulars, they were more afraid of because they were the battle-hardened soldiers like they were. Militia is one thing. The regulars are another. So the nearest force was led by Lieutenant Colonel Alfred Booker, who kind of gets a bad rep, and you're about to see why. But Private A.G. Gilbert of the Queen's Own Number 7 Company, he recorded, quote, "As soon as it was known that the Fenians were ahead and in position, we were formed into battle order. The skirmishers still ahead. The Fenians could be distinctly seen by this time running through the woods to warn their companions of our approach." This guy here on the screen is Alfred Booker. So Booker, as explained earlier, he decides to deploy his militia against the Fenian skirmishers, and at the end we'll have a map to kind of show this all being played out. But A.G. Gilbert continues with, a feature in the Fenians' position was the fact that they arranged so that we had nothing but fences to go over from the beginning to the end. And well did they pepper us when climbing over. So here's a map of the kind of Battle of Ridgeway. The Battle of Ridgeway right here. So we have... Here are the Canadian forces. Here's where the Fenian skirmishers were first seen. Here's where the battle actually takes place, kind of in and around here. As you can see, it's pretty open. Pretty open, and this is where that all takes place. The Fenians are all kind of scattered in skirmisher formations around here and around here. And they are going to, these green militiamen are going to deploy along here to sort of face the Fenians. So the Fenian skirmishers are deployed, but they are driven back by the Canadian militia, and they were armed mostly with 1853 Enfields, which come 1866 were outdated rifled muskets, but that's what they had. So the skirmishers, the Fenian skirmishers withdrew, and what they wanted to do was they wanted to try to pull the Canadian militia out in the open, so that way they could just constantly pepper them. And the terrain was perfect for it. And A.G. Gilbert again described the scene very well. He says, quote, "The Fenians were all crouching down behind the fence, a long black line, and opposed to them was the Queen's own company, the Queen's own number 5 company. Then a shot from the number 5 company, and soon a continuous roar of musketry greeted us. The bullets in showers whizzed past our ears. The number 5 company, this is the interesting part of this, the number 5 company of the Queen's Own was actually armed with Spencer repeating rifles, the rifle that you see here on screen. The only problem is that they weren't trained with how to use these guns. Now remember, this is a time where muskets were a thing. Muskets were basically the only gun that you had, and the Civil War is what really changed all of that. So repeating rifles were an extreme rarity. And these guys just were no trained. They had hardly any ammunition, and they didn't know how to use them. So a musket was a musket. If you learn how to load one muzzle loader, you know how to load them all, essentially. That's not really true. That's a vast oversimplification, but in terms of a repeating rifle, not so much really. And a Spencer is a weird thing because it's kind of like this odd mishmash of like a percussion cap musket, but also like a Winchester, like a lever action. It's a weird combination, and it takes some getting used to. And these men just didn't have it, so they didn't know what they were doing. So they had that going against them. So the remainder of the Queen's Own, they were just called forward. So that, like A.G., what's his name? A.G. Gilbert, he's in the 7th Company. They are all called forward by the bugle, and most took position behind this number 5 company. And these guys were clearly the skirmishers, since they had their repeating rifles. So the Fenians withdraw, they take cover in the woods, and they basically use the woods to sort of screen their movement from the British. And Booker, the commander of the Canadian forces, he orders an advance with the bayonet, and they do. And the Canadian Highland Company has also deployed on the Fenian flank. So now the Fenians are being flanked as well. This is a precarious situation that the Fenians find themselves in. What ends up happening is unbelievably confused. Very confused. And it's debated about to this day as to what exactly happens, and quite frankly, just because of all the sources sort of saying different things, I think it was kind of a mishmash of all of them. But essentially, some Fenian scouts are said to have been mistaken for cavalry, which isn't really true, because it turned out that the Fenians didn't really have anyone on horseback during this invasion. And they had no cavalry at all. But Private A.G. Gilbert recalls that he heard somebody cry out that there was cavalry coming, that there was cavalry approaching rapidly from the Fenians. but he believes that what ended up happening in hindsight, it was the Fenians who were actually saying, hey, here comes the cavalry, as an act of deceit, and as an act of deceit, and to deceive the Canadian forces up against them, to sort of buy them more time. Well, whatever the reason was, it worked, because the way you would repel cavalry was you would have your men form square, because horses didn't like to penetrate a giant line of men. And the order was given to form square, and it was called, which Booker immediately countermanded. And he said, don't form square, that's just silly. Don't form square, don't listen to that. But him countermanding that order ended up causing some chaos as well, because suddenly they're getting contradicting orders. Is there cavalry coming? Is there nothing coming? What's going on? And it's around this time that the Fenians apparently see some of this chaos. They see something, they manage to regroup themselves, and in the process manage to fire a couple of volleys toward the Canadian militia. And Lieutenant Colonel Alfred Booker, he then tried to rectify the situation by ordering the men back into their respective companies, like they should be, before forming square. And most of them did so, apparently. Most of them did manage to get into position where they were supposed to go. People were supposed to... the militia was going where, despite their lack of training, despite the fact that they were militia, did what they were supposed to do, did what they were trained to do, and listened to their commander, doing exactly what he wanted. But then what happened is that several primary sources say that they heard a bugle call to retreat. So A.G. Gilbert actually recalled that the retreat was actually in good order, but a lot of other sources say that it was a complete and total rout, and not just Fenian sources. A lot of Canadian sources say that it became a total panic. So what was kind of happening at around this time was that British regulars had also just arrived in time. You saw the red marker on the map that I displayed earlier, showing what direction the British regulars were coming in. Remember, the Fenians were very scared of the regulars. Not so much the militia, but the regulars, yes. A.G. Gilbert recalled that the retreating was in good order, not so. The British regulars had also arrived at around this time, and it's just a comedy of errors, because what happens is they end up seeing the militia start falling back and pulling and retreating, and they say, oh shit, well then we better pull back too, figure out what's going on, so yeah, bye-bye. And so what happens is anyone who stood the ground saw the British regulars starting to pull back, and like, shit, now we gotta run because they're pulling back. And then on top of that, some people apparently mistook the British regulars for Fenians. And that sent the militia into total panic, into a complete and total panic. And it was all a mess. It was a giant mess. And I can't say that I really blame Booker for the disorder. He got a lot of the blame for all of this, but I can't really say that I blame him. I think it is genuinely just sort of the inexperience of the Canadian militia at this time. They were very weak, a big hodgepodge of different men. And again, I think the Fenians had at least a little bit more experience in this realm than even the Canadian militia did. And I think Booker gets wrongly blamed for a lot of what happened. And they were just poorly trained, poorly equipped. Didn't know how to use the rifles that they had. And we talked about the Spencers, and it was just a total mess. It was just a total mess. And once the retreat started, it just couldn't be stopped. And yeah, they were fighting a relatively well-organized, battle-hardened foe. And so General John O'Neill, the Fenian, he arrives on scene, and he sees that, oh my god, hey, there's a rout happening. The Canadians are running in total disarray. He orders a bayonet charge. He has the Fenians charge, and that completely eviscerates any order that was left within the Canadian militia. And it's a total panic, and the Fenians managed to push the Canadians off the field, and in the process, they now have seized Ridgeway. It is a Fenian victory. It shouldn't have been a Fenian victory, but it ended up being a Fenian victory. And they seize it. The battle lasted a total of around 90 minutes or so. And with all the fighting, 9 were killed, 37 were wounded, and 22 of that 37 would eventually die of their wounds. What a farce. What a farce. And it's pretty crazy. But the Fenians managed to seize Ridgeway, which bolstered their morale quite a bit, because remember, they're cut off, and a lot of them are kind of timid and scared of the fact that they were cut off because of the U.S. gunboats. But what happens are spotters, Fenian spotters, quickly realize that there are a lot of British regulars approaching in force. A lot of them. And so O'Neill makes a decision. Now this is an unattainable situation that we're in. We're going to pull back to something more attainable, and we're going to go back to Fort Erie. So despite the fact that the Fenians ultimately won the Battle of Ridgeway, they withdrew. It was an unobtainable position. They withdrew to Fort Erie, where they could indeed put up a stiff defense if they wanted to. So despite the fact that the Canadians were just defeated in this battle, morale was shockingly high for the Canadians, despite this loss. And a tune quickly appeared among the troops, declaring their loyalty to the Crown and to Britain in sort of a reaction to the Irish. Tramp, 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 the boys are marching. Cheer up, let the Fenians come, for beneath the Union Jack we will drive the Fenians back. In fact, that was the song that I was playing during the Be Right Back segment. That was the song right there, and that was written at around this time, despite the fact that they had just suffered a defeat. So what follows that same day was the Battle of Fort Erie. The Battle of Fort Erie is not as well documented as the Battle of Ridgeway, because it isn't quite as glorious or as silly. It isn't quite as dramatic, I should say. But essentially, what happened was a company of Wayland field artillery landed to find no Fenians there. There were no Fenians at Fort Erie at all. So they're like, okay, let's move in here and let's set up. Now, to be clear, this field battery, they didn't have their cannons. They didn't have them yet. They had no guns. So what they did, they had a total of around 70 to 80 men, and they were mixed with the Canadian volunteers. And those Canadian volunteers, so not only did they not have their cannons, but these Canadian volunteers were armed with smoothbore Victoria carbines. You want to talk about outdated? That's stuff from the late 1830s and 1840s that these men are using as their primary weapons. And these guys sort of set up camp. You know, they're setting up, trying to reassess the situation. They have no idea that General O'Neill has turned around with his 800 Fenians after the Battle of Ridgeway. And this field battery was led by a guy named Lieutenant Colonel Dennis. I couldn't find a picture of him, unfortunately. And Dennis did not believe that the Battle of Ridgeway was actually a defeat for Canada. He heard the fighting up ahead. He heard the musket fire. But he could not wrap his head around the fact that Canada would be defeated by these dumb Fenians. And they were. So O'Neill heard a firefight between Canadian militia and some Fenian skirmishers to his rear. And in the process, he just suddenly appears. The Fenians quickly overpower that band of 70 to 80 Canadian militia and even surround them. And most of the militia surrendered at around this time, but these guys were led by a guy named Captain King, who apparently put up a staunch fight, despite the fact that him being outnumbered a crap ton. So he and about 25 other Canadian militiamen, they just continued to fight, and apparently they managed to hold their ground for 20 minutes. For 20 minutes. Major G.T. Dennis, was it Colonel? Was it he? Yeah, I think I made a mistake there. I think that's supposed to be Lieutenant Colonel Dennis. See, yeah, I'm checking my notes right now. You see, I have two ranks here for this guy named Dennis. I have one that says Lieutenant Colonel, and then now I have one that says Major. So forgive me. He's either a Lieutenant Colonel or he's a Major. So forgive me for not exactly knowing that. But so he recalled the scene where he saw Captain King, and he said, quote, Those with Captain King behaved with the greatest gallantry, fighting desperately against overwhelming odds until the Fenians had closed in upon them, using the bayonet freely. Dennis then took 2 artillerymen with him, and he decided to make a run for it. I mean, some people would say that's pretty cowardly. I personally don't see him having any... 60 guys versus 800, and it's not much of a fight there. Both of those artillerymen were captured, but Dennis managed to hide in a nearby house. And he dropped his uniform in exchange for laborer's clothing, and he managed to sort of disguise himself as one of the locals. And he managed to slip through the Fenian lines and get to the nearest Canadian forces, and he told them what just happened at Fort Erie. And at the end of this fight, no one was killed. Several were wounded, but no one was killed. At least from what I found. And the Fenians decided, okay, we can't go back to Ridgeway. We're going to stay here at Fort Erie for the night and see what happens the next day. So 2 battles were fought on June 2nd, 1866, right at the Canadian border. Well, by dawn on June 3rd, 1866, 500 Canadian militia then organized and began to march on Fort Erie. By 2 o'clock a.m., June 3rd, 1866, Fort Erie was completely abandoned. Sweeney and the Fenians had nowhere else to go, and they were now trapped. So O'Neill decided that it was time to retreat back into the safety of the United States. And ironically, he ended up surrendering to the U.S. Naval Party from the USS Michigan near Buffalo. So the very ship that they sabotaged to get their men over into Canada, they now surrendered to. And I can't help but laugh at the irony of all of that. All of that. And by 9 o'clock a.m. on June 3rd, Fort Erie was then recaptured by the Canadians, and the Fenians were completely gone from Canadian soil. And the Canadians doubted that the Fenians would attack there again, but they remained on high alert because, hey, all these newspapers going around, and Roberts sure is beating his chest quite a bit about invading Canada and capturing a province, so the Canadians remain on high alert after this whole ordeal ends. So because of this ordeal, the U.S. government kind of has no choice but to get involved by this point, because this is quickly devolving into an international disaster. On June 6th, 1866, Andrew Johnson officially got General Ulysses S. Grant and General George S. Meade involved and said, arrest those Fenians and stop them from any further incursions into Canada. And the U.S. officially makes it known that they will be a neutral party in this conflict between the Fenians and the Canadians, that they will not take part in the actual invasion itself. They had to make that clear. So Andrew Johnson's official order read as follows, or a part of it anyways. I do furthermore authorize and empower Major General G.G. Meade, commander of the military division of the Atlantic, to employ the land and naval forces of the United States and militia thereof to arrest and prevent the setting on foot and carrying on expeditions into British North America. Well, there you go. That kind of puts a damper on any of the Fenians' ambitions right there. So many of the Fenians are indeed arrested, but kind of mildly so. They were treated pretty decently, and again, I think a lot of that has to do with the anti-British and Canadian sentiment still felt within the United States at around this time. And most of these Fenians were held for just 10 days, and they were released upon the condition that they signed a paper saying that they would make no more attempts to go into Canada. Stop it, you. Bad Fenian. You are a bad Fenian. You will not do any more incursions into Canada. You will not invade a foreign country. You are been a very bad Fenian. They essentially just get a slap on the wrist for creating an act of terrorism into a sovereign nation, or at least a province of a sovereign nation. So, and the U.S., begins to crack down, begins cracking down on those on the east as well, because that's what we're going to get into next. Because remember, this whole thing was part of a two-pronged event. Don't forget that. We can't forget. This happened in Canada West. We now got to go over to Canada East, which takes us into part 3. And gentlemen, I'm going to take another water break because my throat is absolutely killing me right now. Let's get into this. This one is pretty good too. We will be right back, and I'll see you in just a little bit as we get into the invasion of Quebec.
The colour of old Ireland alone should here be seen. 'Tis the colour of the martyr dead, our own immortal green. Then up for the green, boys, and up for the green. Oh, 'tis down in the dust and a shame to be seen. But we've hands, oh, we've hands, boys, full strong enough, I ween, to rescue and to raise again our own immortal green.
They may say they have power, 'tis vain to oppose. 'Tis better to obey and live than surely die as foes. We can scorn all their threats, boys, whatever they may mean. For we trust in God above us, and we dearly love the green. So we'll up for the green, boys, and up for the green. Oh, to die is far better than be cursed as we've been.
And we've hearts, oh, we've hearts, boys, full true enough, I ween, to rescue and to raise again our own immortal green. They may swear, as they often did, our wretchedness to cure, but we'll never trust John Bull again and let his lies allure. No, we won't, Bull, for now or evermore. For we've hopes on the ocean and we've trust on the shore. Then up for the green, boys, and up for the green. Shout it back to the Sassenach, we'll never sell the green. For our tone is coming back, and with men enough, I ween, to rescue and avenge us and our own immortal green.
Oh, remember the days the rain we disturbed at Limerick and Too's Blackwater and Benburn, and asked this proud Saxon if our blows he'd enjoy when we met him at the battlefield of France at Fontenoy.
Then we'll up for the green, boys, and up for the green. Oh, 'tis still in the dust and a shame to be seen. But we've hearts and we've hands, boys, full strong enough, I ween, to rescue and to raise again our own unsullied green. Then we'll up for the green, boys, and up for the green. Oh, 'tis still in the dust and a shame to be seen. But we've hearts and we've hands, boys, full strong enough.
Well, welcome back. This will be the final part of this this little lecture that I'm kind of giving on the Fenian invasion into Canada. We just discussed the failed and botched invasion of Canada West. Well, now we've turned our eyes to the east and the invasion into Quebec. Now, I have a bit of a personal kind of stake in all of this, because this happened not too far away from where I grew up. If you really look at it, not too far away from where I grew up. And I had no idea that any of this existed, which is one reason why it captivated me so much and why I kind of went balls deep in the research of this whole thing and went down a very deep rabbit hole, as I usually do when I get obsessed with something. And so I kind of have a bit of a personal stake in this, and I find this a little bit more fascinating. But there's a lot less written about this part of the invasion than what happened over in Canada West, that one, the Battle of Ridgeway. Probably because it isn't quite as dramatic as that, but it's still no less entertaining and no less farcical. So let's actually dive into this, shall we? So welcome to part 3. So remember, they get a late start. The invasion of Canada East is a late start. And they started a few days after Canada West had failed. That's when they start, and they were led, because I need to remind you guys, this attack was supposed to happen at the exact same time as what was going on in Canada West, because Canada West was supposed to just be a diversion for what was going on in Canada East. But instead, it doesn't happen at all during the invasion of Canada West. Nothing goes to plan. And I don't even think it was even attempted to happen until after the invasion. I don't think until the failed invasion of the West. So what the hell happened? And the truth is, we don't really know. We don't really know what the hell happened. But it doesn't even start until several days after the Fenians surrender by Fort Erie to the USS Michigan and all that, and many of them are getting arrested. And of course, the U.S. government has now begun to crack down as well. So this execution is unbelievably, it's haphazardly thrown together. Clearly at the last second. It's kind of like a last-ditch effort to try to seize something out of this whole ordeal. And again, I want to remind you, this was supposed to be the main attack. Now, the newspapers once again tip the Canadians that the Fenians are going to invade into Quebec. Because once again, the Fenians can't shut their mouths, particularly Roberts, their wonderful president. It does rally some of the Fenians and stuff like that, but you know, Roberts and Sweeney, they were like expecting something around 16,000 Fenians to arrive to take part in this invasion, and they wound up only getting around 1,000. So that didn't really work out for them too well, did it? And it just tipped their hand because they couldn't keep their mouth shut. So the U.S. government really began cracking down on the Fenian activity, basically to appease Britain, to just get them off their back. And General Meade actually ordered that all shipment of arms on the northern frontier, that they needed to be seized immediately into the hands of the government because of Canada West, what just happened over there. And so that made it very difficult for those over by Canada East for that invasion to actually get their arms cached and to get the muskets that they need to actually carry out the invasion. And General Sweeney actually hoped, he actually at this point, because of the failure of Canada East, had no hope. Canada West, he had no hope for Canada East. He had no hope for the invasion of Quebec. He knew that this wasn't going to work. That optimism that he had for the invasion into the Niagara River area was dashed. So he sort of only haphazardly backed what General Speer was going to be doing over in the east. But the invasion actually officially kind of kicked off at around 10 o'clock a.m., and the Fenians shockingly seemed hopeful, and they were led by a guy named General Speer, S.P. Speer, and he was, again, a veteran of the American Civil War and an actual general, and he launched the invasion from Franklin, Vermont. That is where the 1,000 Fenians accumulated, and they decided to head into Canada, was through Franklin, Vermont. So here's a map of the area. You can see here the dotted line. That is the border between Vermont and Quebec, and this is where Franklin is. This is where St. Albans is. Remember this here, St. Albans. This is where the very first Fenian raid stopped. Right? This is where it stopped. So now here's where they are now, and here's where they cross the border. And they stop there, and as you can see, they don't get very far, do they? They don't get very far. So the course of action. Let's see, in Artinium. So immediately the Fenians seize a little town called Pigeon Hill, which still exists to this day. And they were met with stubborn resistance from the locals. They were not cooperating with them at all, like Speer had hoped. Speer hoped that, like O'Neill and Sweeney, and Roberts for that matter, that the locals would be kind of sympathetic towards their cause and want to kind of piss off the British government, when in reality the opposite happened. They were met with an extremely cold shoulder, and they already don't have enough ammunition, enough weapons for their 1,000 men, and they're already being met with the cold shoulder. I'm sure the events, had they invaded at the same time like they were supposed to, as what happened over in Canada West, it might have been a little different. The hostility might not have been as heavy, but because of that failed invasion over there, and that, of course, spreading through the Canadian provinces like wildfire, they knew this invasion was probably coming, and they weren't happy. They were just pissed. Had the Fenians invaded when they were supposed to, that resistance probably would have been a little more minimal, and probably a little more bearable as a result. So unlike the Canada West invasion, these men were sparsely armed, as I explained before. Most were just armed with 300 carbines. And now I'm assuming that those carbines were either Sharps or Spencer carbines. And they had little for the proper cartridges. Now, when I learned that they had little for the proper cartridges, a part of me actually thinks that they might have actually been using the Burnside carbine, which was, believe it or not, the third most popular carbine, cavalry carbine, used in the American Civil War. And I had no idea about this thing. I didn't even know this thing existed until around a year ago. And that gun's pretty goddamn cool, but it also has a very specific cartridge that kind of goes with a really peculiar looking thing. And it's quite possible that a lot of the Fenians were actually using the Burnside carbine. But the gun that you see here on this slide is actually a Sharps carbine, which was often used by the cavalry during the American Civil War. But despite all of that and everything like that, General Spear waits in Pigeon Hill. He just kind of fiddles around for a little while. There was indeed a little bit of a skirmish that happened. There was a small skirmish that occurred near the town of Freelisburg in Saint-Armain. And the Fenians quickly overcame this small Canadian militia posted there. And this also allowed the rest of the Fenians to occupy Pigeon Hill, where they would remain for the remainder of the night. Now, in this time, General Spear, he waited for he was promised 500 muskets being sent up from Vermont to the border. It turns out that those 500 muskets were most likely seized because of General Meade's orders. And he wrote a dispatch and sent it south. It read, quote, I feel in most excellent spirits, and if I can hold my own until the 500 muskets and 100,000 rounds arrive, I shall have no doubt of success. So again, that sort of blind optimism kind of peeking through even with General Spear. They all had it. I don't know where that blind optimism came from, but they all seemed infected by it. It was almost like they bought into their own propaganda. But something that sort of separated Spear from O'Neill is that in O'Neill, with what was happening in Ridgeway and Fort Erie, he made it a point not to cause property damage of the Canadian locals. And General Spear had no such reservations, and a part of me thinks it's probably because he was greeted with such a cold shoulder. He said, all right, fine, we'll be a dick too. And the Fenians foraged freely. They were killing livestock, and they were blatantly intimidating the locals, along with a nearby Montreal Cavalry Corps, treating them like crap, stealing their food and everything like that. These Fenians were kind of a band of vagabonds, if you really look at it. Well, the Canadian forces arrive early on June 8th, 1866, and the Fenians quickly saw them, and anyone who was sort of in the skirmishing line out in front quickly withdrew back in towards the barricades that the Fenians had made around Pigeon Hill. And they did. They wanted to put up a proper fight. However, they were now facing not just a bunch of British regulars who were ready to pounce on this invasion, unlike they were with Canada West, but also, Canadian cavalry and Canadian artillery. So these ragtag, undermanned, underarmed Fenians are now going up against the brunt of the Canadian army. And one member of the Canadian Royal Guides cavalry actually described the upcoming battle very well, and I want to read to you exactly what he wrote. He said, and I quote, "We rode along and soon came upon a mob of the enemy, perhaps a couple hundred all told, racing for the boundary, aka the U.S. border. Up the crest of the hill, the Royal Artillery was unlimbering its guns, ready for action. As soon as we neared them, our captain ordered a charge, telling us to use only the flat side of our swords. Shows you how seriously they were taking this. And in a minute, we were in among them, slashing right and left. I saw fellows tumbling head over heels as they were struck. Quite a number of Fenians emptied their guns, and I heard the zip of bullets about my head. In this running fight, soon reached the boundary line. There, a company of United States regulars was stationed, and as fast as the Fenians tumbled over the line, he was seized and disarmed. We came charging right up to the boundary, but were warned by the American officer to... We came charging right up to the boundary, and were warned by the American officer in charge not to cross it. Of course, we had nothing to do but obey. But our commander took advantage of the occasion to express very vigorously his opinion of the United States government for not having prevented this raid. The American officer merely shrugged his shoulders. I think that sort of describes the debauchery or the whole farce of that situation in general. I mean, the fact that they were using the broadsides of their swords, too. They weren't even looking to kill the Fenians. They were just a mob that needed to be dealt with, unlike those from Canada West who put up a fight and managed to actually kind of supposedly rout the Canadian military. So I think that I just really liked that that guy's quote, because I think it kind of paints how piss poor of a job the Fenians did at defending themselves. But also, what did they do? The moment they got pressured, they ran like scared children. These guys ran like scared children. Again, most of them weren't armed or anything like that. Most of them, if they were armed, didn't have ammunition for their guns. So I don't know how they even thought, I don't even know how Spear even remotely thought that this operation was going to succeed whatsoever. So the outcome of this whole thing, a few were wounded. Apparently only one woman was killed, a civilian, and she was shot by a Canadian thinking that she was a Fenian one night while she was out getting water, which is unfortunate, but apparently no one was killed. So that is actually pretty good. So gentlemen, we're going to start wrapping this up finally. I've been yammering on for nearly 3 hours. I should probably, or 2 hours I should say, I should probably shut up, right? So let's talk about some of the conclusions. In the end, the Fenian Raids, guess what? They failed in every way, shape, and form. But despite their failure, President Roberts, who was now in jail, by the way, still bolstered of continued invasions of Canada. He said, and he wrote, and I quote, "Stand by the cause, but not dismayed by obstacles me." You must surmount them, and you will. There is no turning back for us, my countrymen. Our movement must and will advance. I seriously don't know how he could do that, but evidently he did, because the Fenian Raids continued all the way through the 1870s. This was just kind of like one of the more dramatic invasions that they had. The 1871 was also quite big and had a lot to do with the new formation of the Canadian military. So evidently he kept up the strength. He kept up the Fenian movement. And, the Fenians, believe it or not, they looked at these invasions with pride, and they even wrote like a little ballad for it describing the invasion. And I'm going to read it here. It says, "Oh, Canada is a purty place, of gold there is no lack, so I trudge from St. Albans with my musket on my back. We were 500 Fenians, we never knew a fear, while we followed the brave leader whose name is General Spear. While we trod the British soil, and we braved the British Queen, and we flaunted in their eyes the brave old flag of green." So at least you could say they got a cool little song out of it. If there's anything that the Irish are extremely good at, it's writing music. But the Fenians never achieved their goal of Irish independence, but ironically, the Irish Republican Brotherhood did, eventually. And so it just sort of reinforces the idea that the roots of Irish history and American history are very closely tied, especially starting within the 1860s. And again, these are sister organizations that were kind of working together, so I do find that kind of interesting. But the biggest impact was actually on Canada. That's where the Fenian Raids really play a big impact on history in itself. And I didn't realize that this is what did this. I didn't realize it was the Fenian Raids that caused all this. This is the biggest shock for me anyways. Because this led directly to the formation of the Canadian Confederation. It was starting to form before this, don't get me wrong. It wasn't like suddenly it just sprang out of nowhere because of the Fenian Fenian invasion. No, this was starting to form. It was starting to become a thing, but the raids really pushed things along. It sort of lit a fire under their ass. Instead of separate provinces, it was the idea that, well, they were afraid, and they wanted to unify. They were afraid that these Fenians were going to keep invading. There were going to be all these raids, all these little invasions along their border, and they wanted to be protected. And the best way to do that was to unify. And this resulted in a massive surge in Canadian nationalism, and along those lines, which led to the Canadian Confederation, along with massive military reforms. But the ironic thing to come out of all of this is that the Fenian invasion never achieved their goal of Irish independence. It never did. But ironically, it did lead to Canadian solidarity and sort of Canadian independence, as approved by Parliament, as a Commonwealth. I do kind of find that a little ironic. I do kind of find that a little ironic. But to continue with that, massive military reforms came because of the Fenian Raids within Canada. Like, the Canadian military was kind of, I don't want to say born because of the Fenian Raids, that's just not true. But it certainly got closer to what we now know of the Canadian military because of this incident. It definitely strained relationships with the United States, because this was another invasion that happened from the United States into their borders, which was very similar to what happened in 1812, the War of 1812. And many in the U.S. just didn't care. They just thought it was fair. All's fair in love with war. You were supplying the Confederates. Remember, this is only 1866, so those wounds were plenty fresh. And the Americans, basically, in the end, they didn't support the Fenian Raids. Remember, they decided to remain neutral, but they certainly didn't do anything really to stop it. And those who partook in the Fenian Raids, yeah, they only got really a slap on the wrist. And that would kind of bite them in the ass come 1870, when the Fenians decided to go at it again. But that is for a different lecture. So, ladies and gentlemen, that was the Irish invasion of Canada in 1866. Wow. What a farce. What a farce. I love discovering little bits of history like this. I do, because I had no idea that this was a thing. And whenever I find a bit of history where it's like, I had no idea about any of it, I always tend to get obsessed with it, because I want to learn as much as I can about it. I want to learn as much as I can. And in all seriousness, why I did this was because, hey, I didn't really have any topics to go with for the ANP live stream. I had no guests that were going to come on, and quite frankly, I'm in the process of doing so much other crap that I wanted to look into this. And so I sort of threw this together, a whole bunch of my research, because I'm hoping to make this into a documentary. In all seriousness, I live so close to Franklin, Vermont, that I actually want to go there. And I want to go because I know where the Fenians invaded. I know roughly where they crossed the border into Canada, and I want to go there, and I want to sort of see it, and I want to sort of see it from their perspective. Sure, a lot has changed in literally almost 158, almost 160 years, but I want to go to that spot, and I want to see what they were seeing. And again, this all happened, this is the anniversary of all that too. It just sort of happened that way. I didn't plan it that way, I promise you, but it just sort of kind of fell through that way. it happened relatively around this time, June 9th. Remember, the invasion in Canada East started on June 8th. So, yeah, 158 years ago this all happened. And none of this is taught in American schools. So this is one of those things that it's really well known in Canada, as it should be. I mean, it led to the formation of Canada as we know it today, or at least helped push it along, I should say. But over here, we don't know a damn thing about it. And I certainly didn't. And I learned something new from all this. I'm hoping some of you did too. I plan on making this into kind of like a multi-part documentary, not as in-depth or as crazy as what I just did here, but certainly along those lines. I don't know if I'm going to do this kind of thing again. I don't know. There's a lot of work, but and I like the control. I don't think I'm a good lecturer, and I like the control of everything. Plus, I had a bunch of typos in that stupid PowerPoint presentation. I hate the fact that I had to do a PowerPoint presentation, but I thought that was still more interesting to look at than just me standing here and talking out of my ass for 2.5 to 3 hours. Yeah, and in the description below, I will also have a list of all of my sources that I have. I don't believe I have them there yet, because when I made this event, I was still kind of accumulating some notes. But I'll certainly be posting my sources there as well. You can see that I sort of attributed them kind of haphazardly, unfortunately. Once I do my documentaries, I'll do it officially. But I have attributed a lot of the quotes to everything. There's a lot of good primary sources on this that I found that sort of gives breadth and sort of personality to who these people were and what the mentalities were at the time. So this was a lot of fun. This is a lot of fun reading about, and I intend to do more with it. Yeah. Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for tuning in. I am exhausted. I've nearly pulled an all-nighter. Had to do some extra work and everything like that, and I am just exhausted. I am going to hit the sack the moment I'm done with this live stream. So, ladies and gentlemen, I really wish to thank you for listening, for watching, doing whatever it is you want to do. I just love this stuff. This is my bread and butter. I love this sort of stuff. Some more history videos are indeed coming out. More history-related content is going to be kind of coming out. Maybe not so much history in itself, but like me talking about movies, how historically inaccurate the movie is, or even some video games. There's a couple of video games. I've been going kind of on a nostalgia trip lately that I want to talk about, and how they were so much better at capturing the essence of World War II than that SJW crap that we have coming out now. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for watching. All my social media is in the description below. Not the best lecture, I know, but I thought I'd give it a shot, show you what I find, and hopefully you learned something. In the end, this is Noyes of AN Productions saying, sayonara.